Chapter 21. The first visit of Beelzebub to India. Beelzebub continued to speak as follows. Sitting in a chaihana in the small town of Arguenia, I once overheard a conversation among several beings seated not far from me. They were talking and deciding when and how they should go by caravan to Pearl Land. Having listened to their conversation, I gathered that they intended to go there for the purpose of exchanging their turquoise for what are called pearls. I must here, by the way, draw your attention also to the fact that your favourites of former, as well as of contemporary epochs, liked and still like to wear pearls and also the said turquoise, as well as many other what are called precious trinkets for the purpose, as they say, of adorning their exteriors. But if you would like to know my opinion, they do so, of course, instinctively, in order to offset, so to say, the value of their inner insignificance. At that period to which my present tale refers, the said pearls were very rare among the beings of the second Asiatic group, and commanded a high price among them. But in the country Pearl Land, there was at the same time a great number of these pearls, and there, on the contrary, they were very cheap, because pearls at that time were exclusively obtained only from the water spaces surrounding that country. The mentioned conversation of the beings who sat near me in the chaihana in the small town Arguenia then immediately interested me, because at that time I already had the intention of going to that same Pearl Land, where the three-brained beings of the continent Ashhark of the third group bred. And the conversation I then heard at once evoked in my mentation an association to the effect that it might be better to go to the country Pearl Land directly from here with this large caravan of these beings, rather than return the same way to the Sea of Beneficence, and from there, by means of the same ship occasion, to reach this country. Although this journey, which in those days was almost impossible for the beings of the earth, would take us a good deal of time, yet I thought that the journey back to the Sea of Beneficence, with its unforeseeable contingency, would perhaps not take much less time. This association then arose in my mentation chiefly because I had long before heard a great deal about the rare peculiarities of those parts of the nature of that peculiar planet through which the proposed route of the caravan lay. And in consequence, what is called a being love of knowledge, which was already crystallized in me, having received a shock for functioning from all that had been overheard, immediately dictated to my common presence the need to be persuaded of everything personally, directly through my own perceptive organs. So, my boy, owing to what I have said, I intentionally sat with the conversing beings and joined in their deliberations. As a result of it all, we also were then included in the company of their caravan, and 2 days later we set off together with them. I and Ahun then passed through, indeed, very unusual places, unusual even for the general nature of this peculiar planet, certain parts of which, by the way, only became so because before that period this ill-fated planet had already undergone 2 what are called Transapalnian-perturbations, almost unprecedented in the universe. From the first day we had to pass exclusively through a region of various terra firma projections of unusual forms, which had conglomerations of all kinds of intraplanetary minerals. And only after a month's travel, according to their time calculation, did our caravan from Arguenia come to places where in the soil the possibility had not yet been quite destroyed of nature's forming subplanetary formations and creating corresponding conditions for the arising and existing of various one-brained and two-brained beings. After every kind of difficulty, we at last, one rainy morning, ascending a height, suddenly saw on the horizon the outline of a large water space bordering the edges of the continent Ashhark, which was then called Pearl Land. And 4 days later, we came to the chief point of the existence of the beings of that third group, then the city Kaimon. Having arranged there the place of our permanent existence, we did nothing during our first days there but stroll about the streets of the town, observing the specific manifestations of the beings of that third group in the process of their ordinary existence. It cannot be helped, my dear Hassan, now that I have told you the history of the arising of the second group of the three-brained beings of the continent Ashhark. I must tell you also about the history of the arising of the third group. You must indeed tell me, my dear and beloved grandfather, eagerly exclaimed Hassan, and, this time with great reverence, extending his hand upwards, he sincerely said, May my dear and kind grandfather become worthy to be perfected to the degree of the sacred-Anklad. Without saying anything to this, Basebap merely smiled and continued to relate as follows. The history of the arising of this third group of Asiatic beings begins only a little later than that period when the families of hunters for Permarals first came to the shores of the Sea of Beneficence from the continent Atlantis, and having settled there, founded the second group of Asiatic beings. It was just in those, for your contemporary favourites, infinitely remote days, that is, not long before the second Transapalnian-perturbation occurred to this ill-fated planet, that there had already begun to be crystallized in the presences of the three-centred beings then of the continent Atlantis certain consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, on account of which the need, among other needs unbecoming to three-brain beings, began to arise in them to wear, as I have already told you, various trinkets, as it were, for their adornment, and also a kind of famous what is called talisman, which they had invented. One of these trinkets, then on the continent Atlantis, just as now on the other continents of the planet Earth, was and is this same pearl. The said pearl is formed in one-brained beings, which breed in the Saliakooriap of your planet Earth, that is to say, in that part of it which is called Hentralispana, or, as your favourites might express it, the blood of the planet, which is present in the common presence of every planet, and which serves the actualizing of the process of the most great common cosmic Trogoautoegocrat. And there on your planet, this part is called water. This one-brained being, in which the said pearl is formed, used to breed in the Saliakooriap or water areas surrounding the continent Atlantis. But in consequence of the great demand for the said pearl, and therefore of the great destruction of these one-brained pearl-bearing beings, soon none were left near this continent. Thereupon, when those beings there, who made the aim and sense of their existence the destruction of these pearl-bearing beings, that is to say, who destroy their existence only in order to procure that part of their common presence called pearl, merely for the gratification of their quite absurd egoism, found no more of these said pearl-bearing beings in the water area nearest to the continent Atlantis. They, that is, these professionals, then began to look for them in other water areas and gradually moved further and further away from their own continent. Once during these searches of theirs, owing to what are called Saliakooriap displacements, or as they say, prolonged storms, their rafts came unexpectedly to a place where there proved to be a great number of these pearl-bearing beings, and the place itself was extremely convenient for their destruction. These water areas where the destroyers of the pearl-bearing beings then chanced to come, and where these beings bred in large numbers, were just those water areas which surround the place then called Pearl Land, and now called Hindustan or India. For the first days, the aforementioned terrestrial professionals of that time, who had chanced to arrive there, did nothing but gratify to their full their inclinations, which had already become inherent to their presences, in respect of the destruction of these one-brained beings of their planet. It was only later, after they had also by chance found out that almost everything required for ordinary existence arose in abundance on the neighbouring terra firma, that they decided never return to Atlantis, but to settle there for their permanent existence. A few of these destroyers of pearl-bearing beings then sailed to the continent Atlantis, and having exchanged their pearls for various articles which were still lacking in the new place, they returned, bringing with them their own families as well as the families of those who had remained. Later, several of these first settlers of this, for the beings of then of that time, new country, visited their native land from time to time for the purpose of exchanging pearls for articles required by them there, and each time they took back with them a further number of beings, either their relatives or their kinsmen, or just labourers indispensable to their extensive work. So, my boy, from that time on, that part also of the surface of the planet Earth became known to all the three-brained beings there under the name of Land of Beneficence. In this way, before the great second catastrophe to the planet Earth, many beings of the continent Atlantis already existed on this part of the continent Ashhark also. And when that second catastrophe occurred to your planet, then many of the beings who chanced to be saved from the continent Atlantis, chiefly those who already had relatives and kinsmen in that Pearl Land, also gradually collected there. Owing, as always, to their fecundity, they gradually multiplied there and began to populate this part of the terra firma of their planet more and more. At first, they populated there in Pearl Land only two definite regions, namely, the regions around the mouths of the two large rivers which flowed from the interior of Pearl Land into the large water space, just in those places near which many of the mentioned pearl-bearing beings bred. But when the population there greatly increased, they began to populate also the interior of that part of the continent Ashhark. But nevertheless, their favourite regions continued to be the valleys of the two mentioned rivers. Well then, my boy, when I first arrived in Pearland, I decided to attain my aim there also by means of the Havatvernoni, which existed there, that is, through their religion. But it turned out that amongst the beings of this third group of the continent Ashhark, there were at that time several peculiar Havatvernonies, or religions, all based on different, quite independent, what are called religious teachings, having nothing in common with each other. In view of this, I first began seriously studying these religious teachings there, and having in the course of my studies constated that one of them, founded on the teaching of a genuine messenger of our common endless Creator, afterwards called Saint Buddha, had the most followers, I, on becoming acquainted with it, devoted most of my attention to its study. Before continuing to tell you about the three-brained beings breeding just on that part of the surface of the planet Earth, it is, I think, necessary to remark, even if briefly, that they existed and still exist ever since the time when the practice of having peculiar being, Havatvernonies, or religions, began to arise and exist among your favorites, two basic kinds of religious teachings. One kind was invented by those three-brained beings there themselves, in whom, for some reason or other, there arises the functioning of a psyche proper to Hasnamusses. And the other kind of religious teaching is founded there upon those detailed instructions which have been preached, as it were, by genuine messengers from above, who indeed are from time to time sent by certain nearest helpers of our common Father, for the purpose of aiding the three-brained beings of your planet in destroying in their presences the crystallized consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer. The religion which was then followed by most of the beings of the country Pearland, and to become acquainted with which I then devoted my attention, and about which I find it necessary to tell you a little, arose there in the following way. As I later learned, with the multiplication of the three-brained beings of that third group, many beings among them, with the properties of Hasnamusses, were formed into responsible beings. And when these latter began spreading ideas more maleficent than usual among the beings of that group, there was crystallized in the presences of the majority of the three center beings of the third group that special psychic property which, in its totality, already engendered the effect of which greatly hinder the normal exchange of substances actualized by the most great common cosmic Trogoautoegocrat. Well, then, as soon as this lamentable result, also issuing from this planet, was noticed by certain most sacred individuals, it was sanctioned that a corresponding sacred individual should be sent there, especially to that group of beings, for the more or less tolerable regulation of their being existence in accordance with the existence of the whole of that solar system. It was just then that the aforementioned sacred individual was sent to them who, having been coated with the planetary body of a terrestrial being, was called, as I have said, Saint Buddha. The coating of the said sacred individual with the planetary body of a terrestrial three-brained being was actualized there several centuries before my first visit to the country Pearland. At this point in Beelzebub's tales, Hassan turned to him and said, "My dear grandfather, during your tales you have already many times used the expression Hasnamuss. I have until now understood only from the intonation of your voice and from the consonants of the word itself that by this expression you define those three-brained beings whom you always set apart from others as if they deserved objective contempt. Be so kind as always and explain to me the real meaning and exact sense of this word." Whereupon Beelzebub, with a smile inherent in him, said as follows: "Concerning the typicality of the three-brained beings for whom I have adopted this verbal definition, I shall explain it to you at the proper time. But meanwhile, know that this word designates every already definitized common presence of a three-brained being, both those consisting only of the single planetary body, as well as those whose higher being bodies are already coated in them, and in which for some reason or other data have not been crystallized for the divine impulse of objective conscience." Having said only this in divining the word Hasnamuss, Beelzebub continued to speak. "During my detailed studies of the mentioned religion's teaching, I also clarified that after this sacred individual had become finally coated with the presence of a three-brained being there, and had seriously pondered how to fulfill the task that had been laid upon him from above, he decided to attain this by means of the enlightenment of their reason. Here it must without fail be noticed that by that time there had already been crystallized in the presence of Saint Buddha, as the same detailed researches of mine had made clear, a very clear understanding that in the process of its abnormal formation, the reason of the three-centered beings of the planet Earth results in a reason called instinct-terebelnian, that is, a reason which functions only from corresponding shocks from without. Yet, in spite of this, Saint Buddha decided to carry out his task by means of this peculiar reason of theirs, that is, this reason peculiar to the three-centered beings there, and therefore he first of all began informing their peculiar reason with objective truths of every kind. Saint Buddha first assembled many of the chiefs of that group and spoke to them as follows. Beings possessing presences similar to that of the All-Creator himself, by certain all-enlightened and all-justly guiding most sacred final results of the actualization of everything existing in the universe, my essence has been sent to you to serve as a helping factor in the striving of each of you to free yourselves from the consequences of those abnormal being properties, which, in view of highly important common cosmic needs, were implanted in the presences of your ancestors, and passing by heredity from generation to generation, have reached you also. Saint Buddha spoke again about this a little more in detail, but only to certain beings there initiated by him. This second time, as it turned out, he then expressed himself in the following words. Beings with presences for actualizing the hope of our common Father. Almost at the beginning of the rise of your race, there occurred in the process of the normal existence of the whole of our solar system an unforeseen accident which threatened serious consequences for everything existing. For the regulation of that common universal misfortune, there was then required, among other measures, according to the explanations of certain most high, most sacred individuals, a certain change in the functioning of the common presences of your ancestors, namely, there was implanted into their presences a certain organ with special properties, owing to which everything external perceived by their whole presences and transformed for their own coating was afterwards manifested not in accordance with reality. A little later, when the normal existence of your solar system was stabilized and the necessity for certain intentionally created abnormal actualizations had passed, our most all-gracious common Father did not fail to give the command immediately to annul certain artificial measures, among which was the removal from the common presences of your ancestors of the now already superfluous organ Kundabuffer, with all its special artificial properties. And this command was immediately executed by corresponding sacred individuals who superintended such cosmic actualizations. After a considerable time had passed, it was suddenly revealed that although all the properties of the said organ had indeed been removed from the presences of your ancestors by the mentioned most sacred individuals, yet, nevertheless, a certain lawfully flowing cosmic result, existing under the name of predisposition, and arising in every more or less independent cosmic presence, owing to the repeated action in it of any function, had not been foreseen and destroyed in their presences. And so, it turned out that owing to this predisposition, which began to pass by heredity to the succeeding generations, the consequences of many of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer began gradually to be crystallized in their presences. No sooner was this lamentable fact, which proceeded in the presences of the three-brained beings breeding on this planet Earth, first made clear, than, by all gracious sanction of our common Father, a suitable sacred individual was immediately sent here, so that being coated with a presence like your own, and having become perfected by objective reason under the conditions already established here, he might better explain and show you the way of eradicating from your presences the already crystallized consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, as well as your inherited predispositions to new crystallizations. During the period when the said sacred individual, coated with a presence like your own, and who had already attained to the age of a responsible, three-centered being similar to yourself, directly guided the ordinary process of the being existence of your ancestors. Many of them did indeed completely free themselves from the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, and either thereby acquired being personally for themselves, or became normal sources for the arising of normal presences of succeeding beings similar to themselves. But in consequence of the fact that before the period of the said sacred individual's appearance there, the duration of your existence had, owing to very many firmly fixed abnormal conditions of ordinary existence created by yourselves, already become abnormally short, and therefore the process of sacred Rascooarno had also very soon to occur to this sacred individual. That is to say, he also had, like you, to die prematurely. Then, after his death, the former conditions were gradually re-established there, owing on the one hand to the established abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence, and on the other hand, to that maleficent particularity in your psyche called wise-acring. Owing to this set particularity in your psyche, the beings here already of the second generation after the contemporaries of the mentioned sacred individual who had been sent from above began gradually to change everything he had explained and indicated, and the whole of it was finally completely destroyed. Again and again, the same was actualized by the most high common cosmic final results, and each time the same fruitless results were obtained. In this present period of the flow of time, when the abnormal being existence of the three-brained beings of your planet, particularly of the beings arising and existing on that part of the surface of the earth which is called Pearl Land, is already beginning seriously to hinder the normal harmonious existence of the whole of this solar system. My essence is manifested among you from above, in order that here on the spot it may, together with your own essences, find ways and means, under the conditions already fixed here, of freeing your presences from the said consequences now present in them, owing to the absence of foresight on the part of certain most sanely final cosmic results. After having said all this, Saint Buddha thereafter, just by means of talks with them, first cleared up for himself, and afterwards explained to them how the process of their existence must be conducted, and the order in which their positive part should consciously guide the manifestations of their unconscious parts, so that the crystallite consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, and also the inherited predisposition to them, might gradually disappear from their common presences. As the same detailed researches of mine made clear to me, at that period when the inner psyche of the beings of that part of the surface of the earth was guided by this genuine messenger from above, Saint Buddha, they said, for them very maleficent, consequences indeed again began gradually to disappear from the presences of many of them. But to the grief of every individual with pure reason of any gradation whatsoever, and to the misfortune of the three-brained beings of all succeeding generations who arise on that planet, the first succeeding generation of the contemporaries of this genuine messenger from above, Saint Buddha, also began, owing once again to that same particularity of their psyche, namely, of wise acring, which until now is one of the chief results of the conditions of the ordinary being existence abnormally established there. To wise ache with all his indications and counsels, and this time to superwise ache so thoroughly that there reached the beings of the third and fourth generations nothing else but what our Honourable Mullah Nasser Adam defines by the words, only the information about its specific smell. Little by little, they so changed these indications and counsel of his, that if their saintly author himself should chance to appear there, and for some reason or other should wish to make himself acquainted with them, he would not be able even to suspect that these indications and counsels were made by him himself. Here I cannot refrain from expressing my essence grief at that strange practice of these favourites of yours there, which in the course of many other of their centuries, during the process of their ordinary existence, has gradually become, as it were, conformable to law. And in the given case also, the same established and already fixed peculiar practice there served for the modification of all the true indications and exact counsels of Saint Buddha, and for the creation thereby of yet another factor for a still greater dilution of their psyche. This already long established practice there consists in this, that a small, sometimes an almost trifling, cause is enough to bring about a change for the worse, or even the complete destruction of any and every objectively good outer and inner previously established, what is called temple of ordinary existence. Because, my boy, the clarification of certain details of the arising of such a trivial cause, which was in this instance a basis for the distortion of all the true explanations and exact indications also of this genuine messenger from above, Saint Buddha, may provide you with excellent material for better sensing and understanding of the strangeness of the psyche of those three-brained beings who have taken your fancy. I shall tell you about this in as great detail as possible, and shall explain to you just in what sequence the said practice then arose there, which led to the following sad misunderstanding, which began to exist there, which is still manifested particularly clearly. I must inform you first of the two following facts. The first is this, that I cleared up this misunderstanding much later than the period to which my present tale refers. Among other things, I made it clear to myself only during the period of my sixth descent there, when in connection with a question concerning the same Ashhark, about whom I shall soon tell you in detail, it became necessary for me to find out about the activities of that genuine messenger from above, Saint Buddha. And the second fact is this, that unfortunately The basis of the lamentable misunderstanding was certain authentic words contained in one of the explanations of Saint Buddha himself. It turned out, indeed, that Saint Buddha himself had, in the course of his explanation to some of his closest initiates, initiated by himself, very definitely expressed himself concerning the means of the possible destruction in their nature of the mentioned consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer transmitted to them by heredity. He then, among other things, told them very definitely the following. One of the best means of rendering ineffective the predisposition present in your nature of the crystallization of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer is intentional suffering. And the greatest intentional suffering can be obtained in your presences if you compel yourselves to be able to endure the displeasing manifestations of others towards yourselves. This explanation of Saint Buddha, together with other definite indications of his, was spread by his nearest initiates among the ordinary beings there. And after the process of the sacred Rascooarno had occurred to him, it also began to pass from generation to generation. So, my boy, when, as I have already told you, those three center beings there, among the second and third generation of the contemporaries of Saint Buddha, in whose psyche, already from the time of the loss of Atlantis, that peculiarity had been fixed, called the organic psychic need to wiseacre, began. Unfortunately for the ordinary three-centered beings of that period, and unfortunately also for the beings of all succeeding generations, and even for those of the present time, to wiseacre and superwiseacre concerning these counsel of Saint Buddha, then, as a result, a very definite notion became fixed and also began to pass from generation to generation, that this same endurance should without fail be produced in complete solitude. Here that strangeness of the psyche of your favourites then manifested itself just as it now manifests itself, by their not having considered and not considering the obvious fact, obvious, that is, to every more or less sane reason, that the divine teacher, Saint Buddha, in advising them to employ that kind of endurance, of course had in view that they should produce this endurance while existing among other beings similar to themselves, and so that by frequently producing in their presences this sacred being actualization toward the manifestations displeasing to them of other beings similar to themselves, there might thereby be evoked in them what are called those Trentroodianos, or, as they themselves would say, those psychic chemical results, which, in general, in the presence of every three-centered being, form those sacred being data, which actualize in the common presences of the three-centered beings, one of the three holy forces of the sacred being Triamazikamno. And this holy force in beings always becomes affirming towards all the denying properties already present in them. So, my boy, from that time when the mentioned definite notion had begun to exist, your favourites began leaving those already established conditions of being existence, on account of which the predisposition to the crystallization of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer had become intense in their presences, and in which conditions, as the divine teacher Buddha supposed, the said endurance towards others' manifestations displeasing to oneself could alone crystallize in their common presences that park-job duty, which in general is necessary for all three-centered beings. And so, for the purpose of this famous suffering of theirs, many of the three-centered beings of that planet of yours, either singly or in groups, that is to say, with others who thought as they did, began from then on to go away from amongst being similar to themselves. They even organized special colonies for this purpose, where, although existing together, they nevertheless arranged everything so as to produce this endurance of theirs in solitude. It was just then that their famous what are called monasteries came into existence, which exist down to the present time, and in which, as it were, certain of your contemporary favourites, as they say, saved their souls. When I first visited that Pearl Land, most of the three-cent brain beings there, as I have already said, were followers of that same religion, which was based, as it were, on the exact counsel and indications of Saint Buddha himself. And the faith of every one of these beings in this religion was unshakably firm. At the outset of my investigations into the doctrinal subtleties of that religion there, I had as yet come to no definite decision how exactly to utilize it to attain my aim. But when in the course of my investigations I clarified one very definite comprehension, proper to all the followers of that religion, which arose there again owing to a misunderstanding, from the words that had indeed been spoken by Saint Buddha himself, I then at once decided how just to act there through this peculiar Havatvernoni or religion of theirs. It transpired that in his explanations to them about cosmic truths, Saint Buddha had, among other things, told them also that in general, the three-center beings existing on various planets of our great universe, and of course the three-centered beings of the earth also, were nothing else but parts of that most great greatness, which is the all-embracing of all that exists, and that the foundation of this most great greatness is there above, for the convenience of the embracing of the essence of everything existing. This most great foundation of the all-embracing of everything that exists constantly emanates throughout the whole of the universe and coats itself from its particles upon planets, in certain three-centered beings who attained in their common presences the capacity to have their own functioning of both fundamental cosmic laws of the sacred Heptaparaparshinokh and the sacred Triamazikamno, into a definite unit in which alone objective divine reason acquires the possibility of becoming concentrated and fixed. And this has been foreseen and created in this manner by our common Creator, in order that when these certain parts of the great all-embracing, already spiritualized by divine reason, return and reblend with the great Prana, divine source of the all-embracing. They should compose that whole which, in the hopes of our common endless being, may actualize the sense and the striving of all that exists in the whole of the universe. Further, it seems Saint Buddha also told them, you, three-center beings of the planet Earth, having the possibility of acquiring in yourselves both chief fundamental, universal, sacred laws, have the full possibility also of coating yourselves with this most sacred part of the great all-embracing of everything existing, and of perfecting it by the required divine reason. And this great all-embracing of all that is embraced is called Holy Prana. This quite definite explanation of Saint Buddha was well understood by his contemporaries, and many of them began, as I have already said, to strive with eagerness, first to absorb and to quote in their presences the particle of this most great greatness, and afterwards to make inherent to it divine objective reason. But when the second and third generations of the contemporaries of Saint Buddha began wise-acring with his explanations of cosmic truths, they just wise-acred with their peculiar reason and fixed, for its transmission, a very definite notion to the effect that that same Mr. Prana already begins to be in them immediately upon their arising. Thanks to this misunderstanding, the beings of that period and of all subsequent generations, including the contemporary, have imagined and still imagine that without any being part of duty, they are already parts of that most great greatness, which Saint Buddha himself had personally very definitely explained. So, my boy, as soon as I had made this misunderstanding clear to myself, and had clearly constated that the beings of that country Pearland were all, without exception, convinced that they were already particles of Mr. Prana himself, I then at once decided to use this misunderstanding and there also to attain my aim through that religion of theirs. Before saying more about this, it must without fail be noticed that concerning these same explanations of Saint Buddha's, namely, that he had supposedly said that beings already have in themselves, at their arising, a particle of the most great greatness, my personal detailed investigations quite clearly showed me that he never could possibly have said just that. And he could not have said it because, as the same detailed investigations of mine have cleared up to me, when Saint Buddha once happened to be among his devoted disciples in the locality Senkoo-ori, he definitely said, if this most sacred prana is crystallized in you, consciously or unconsciously on the part of your I, you must without fail bring the perfecting of the individual reason of the totality of its most holy atoms to the required gradations. Otherwise, this most holy coating will, changing various exterior coatings, suffer and languish eternally. Here it is interesting to notice that concerning this they were warned by still another saint individual, also a genuine messenger from above, namely, the saint Kerminushnasha. And this saint and genuine messenger gave this warning to them in the following words. Blessed is he that hath soul, blessed also is he that hath none. But grief and sorrow are to him that hath in himself its conception. So, my boy, when I made this clear to myself, there in Pearland, I at once decided to use this error of theirs for the accomplishment of my aim. There in Pearland also, just as in the city Gulf, I first invented a detailed addition to the mentioned religion teaching, and afterwards, by every possible means, I began spreading this invention of mine. I began to spread there in Pearland that most sacred Prana, about which our divine teacher Saint Buddha had explained, is already present not only in people, but also in all the other beings that arise and exist on our planet Earth. A particle of that fundamental, most great, all-embracing, namely, the most sacred Prana, has already from the very beginning settled in every form of being of every scale, breathing on the surface of the planet, in the water, and also in the atmosphere. I regret to have to say here, my boy, that I was then constrained more than once to emphasize that these words had been uttered by the very lips of Saint Buddha himself. The several beings there with whom I had meanwhile established friendly relations, and whom without any discussion I first of all persuaded them of that invention, not only immediately fully believed it, but afterwards also very effectually helped me, of course unconsciously, in spreading this new invention of mine. Here also these friends of mine always and everywhere, very zealously and passionately, prove to other beings like themselves that this was just so and could not possibly be otherwise. In short, there in Pearland, owing to this second invention of mine, the desired results were unexpectedly rapidly brought about. And there in Pearland, owing simply to my invention, your favourites so greatly changed their essence relations towards the beings of the forms, that they not only ceased to destroy the existence of these beings for their famous sacrificial offerings, but even began very sincerely, with the whole of their being, to regard these beings of other forms as beings like themselves. If only it had all continued like that, it would have been very good. But here as well, just as in the country Marloplisi, they soon began, as is proper to them, to wiseacre and to manifest all kinds of comical aspects of their Havatvernoni. For instance, only a quarter of their year after the commencement of my preaching, you could see when strolling down the street of the city Kaimon, almost at every step, beings there walking on what are called stilts. And they walked on stilts in order not to risk crushing some insect or other, a little being, as they thought, just like themselves. Many of them were afraid to drink water that had not been freshly taken from a spring or stream, because they thought that if the water had been a long time out of the spring or stream, little beings might got into the water, and without seeing them, they might suddenly swallow these poor little creatures like themselves. Many of them took the precaution to wear what are called veils, lest poor little beings like themselves in the air might chance to enter mouths or noses, and so on and so forth. From that time on, various societies began to arise there in Pearland, in the city of Kaimon and its outskirts, whose aim was to protect defenseless beings of various forms, both those existing among them and those they called wild. Rules existed in all such societies prohibiting not only their destruction for sacrificial offerings, but also the use of their planetary bodies for the first being food. My boy. Owing once again merely to the strangeness of their psyche, the intentional suffering and conscious labours of this sacred individual, Saint Buddha, who had been specially actualized for them with a planetary presence similar to theirs, have ever since hovered and still hover in vain. Nor have they yet actualized any lawfully expected real results whatsoever, but have engendered and until now continue to engender only all kinds of pseudo-teachings there, like those existing there in recent times under the names of occultism, theosophy, spiritualism, psychoanalysis, and so on, which before as now are means only for the obscuring of their already, without this, obscured psyche. It is needless to say that from the truths indicated by Saint Buddha himself, absolutely nothing has survived and reached the beings of the present time. Half of one of the words, however, managed to reach even the contemporary beings of that unparalleled planet. And this half of a word reached them in the following way. Saint Buddha, among other things, explained to the beings of Pearland how and to what part of the body of their ancestors the said famous organ Kundabuffer had been attached. He told them that the Archangel Luisos had by a special means made this organ grow in their ancestors at the extremity of that brain which in them, just as in you, nature has placed along their back in what is called the spinal column. Saint Buddha, as I also made clear, then also said that though the properties of this organ had been entirely destroyed in their ancestors, yet the material formation of this organ had remained at the lower extremities of this brain. And this material formation, being transmitted from generation to generation, had also reached them. This material formation, he said, now has no significance whatever in you, and it can be completely destroyed in the course of time if your being existence proceeds as is becoming to three-centered beings. It was just when they began wiseacring and inventing various forms of that famous suffering of theirs that they also played their usual tricks with this word. Namely, first of all, as the root of the second half of this word chanced to coincide with a word in the language of that time which meant reflection, and as they had also invented a means for destroying this material formation rapidly, and not merely in the course of time, as Saint Buddha had told them, they also wiseacred about this word according to the following rumination of their bob-tailed reason. Of course, When this organ is in action, it ought to have in its name also the root of the word to reflect. Now, since we are destroying even its material basis, the name must end with a word whose root means former. And because former in their current language was then pronounced Lina, they changed the second half of this word, and instead of reflection, they stuck in the mentioned Lina, so that instead of the word Kundabuffer, they obtained the word Kundalina. Thus, it was that a half of the word Kundabuffer survived, and being transmitted from generation to generation, finally reached your contemporary favourites also, accompanied, of course, by 1,001 different explanations. Even the contemporary learned beings also have a name made up of very abstruse Latin roots for that part of the spinal marrow. The whole of what is called Indian philosophy, now existing there, is based also on this famous Kundalina. And about the word itself, there exist thousands of various occult, secret, and revealed sciences, which explain nothing. And as regards the way in which the contemporary terrestrial learned beings of what are called the exact sciences define the significance of this part of the spinal marrow, that, my dear boy, is a profound secret. And it became a secret because several centuries ago, this explanation suddenly, for no reason whatever, entered the favorite mole of the famous Scheherazade, which that incomparable Arabian fantasist chanced to have on the right side of her adorable navel. And there, this learned explanation remains perfectly preserved down to the present day. When I was quite convinced that I had succeeded so easily in the destruction, perhaps for a long time, of that terrible practice among the beings of that group there in Poland, I decided to stay there no longer, but to return to the Sea of Beneficence to our ship occasion. When we were quite ready to leave that Poland, the intention suddenly arose in me not to return to the Sea of Beneficence by the way we had come, but by another way quite unusual in those days. Namely, I decided to return through the locality which was later called Tibet.